Okay, everybody, so what's happening now is a little bit of changeover. You have sort of 60 seconds to stretch your sillies, as they say on Sesame Street. So 3 years ago, we had our first panel that was specifically focused on human rights. And a big part of the move to do that was a lot of what we learned working with Edward and Bickham here from the World Gold Council, and a number of people, including Shari, who is on this panel today, Shari Gittleman, and others, realizing this is front and center. And so we did something that was different for us. I mean, the conference has evolved a great deal over 16 years. And we had a human rights panel. And at that time, we made a commitment that we would address this topic every year. And so this year, I'm absolutely thrilled that this issue, if in effect, launches our days, because there is no aspect of life that is not affected by the notion of human rights, even if you happen to have a workshop with one other person, or if you look globally at large-scale situations. So the topic today is how do we define human rights, which is a sticky wicket and a really challenging question. And this type is terribly small, but I'm really thrilled to welcome Shari Gittleman, who is now, I'm not sure exactly what it is, lead of the Global Coalition for Action on Artisanal and Small-Scale Gold Mining. The part I wasn't sure about was the exact title, because it seems to change. Maura Johnson, and she's been here before, and we're thrilled that she is back. Maura Johnson, who is just finishing as the head of the Secretariat for the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. 3 is a charm. At long last, we welcome Jane Nelson. We have tried. Courtship is long, but the kiss is always worth it, right? She is the founding director of the Corporate Responsibility Initiative at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, and a senior research fellow, and I'm really having trouble here, Mosavi Rahmani Center for Business and Government at Harvard as well. And the rose amidst the leaves is Edward Bickham, who is a senior advisor, again, with sometimes modifiers not, but senior advisor for the World Gold Council, to the World Gold Council, and honestly, from whom I've learned so very much. So I'm really thrilled that this is our first panel, and please, it's all yours.
Thank you very much. How's the sound level? Okay, good. We just haven't tried these microphones out before. So, thank you very much indeed, Lisa, both for conceiving this event and all the work that you have put into constructing, panel by panel, a remarkable list of contributors. I've been around a bit, as you might be able to tell, and going back to the 1990s and the early 2000s, there was a great deal of turmoil and conflict about the role of companies in society. And there was a lot of toing and froing about the issues of human rights in relation to companies, in particular working in the mining sector, the impacts of large-scale activities on the natural environment, on remote communities, and how those were to be best handled. And the areas of focus or debate or turmoil included around security, around the terms where resettlement was sometimes necessary, the interface between host countries and indigenous peoples, water and its impact on other livelihoods, and the issues of corruption. And a number of new initiatives were taken in those early years of this century. In 2002, at the Johannesburg Summit on Sustainable Development, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative was conceptually launched to increase accountability for how the extractive sector dealt with intergenerational equity, the provision of revenues, and what were done with those revenues. The Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights started in 2000, bringing together companies, civil society, and governments to try and establish good practice. And we'll hear more about the voluntary principles in a moment. And then a bit later, in 2010, in the face of the terrible loss of life in the civil war in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the OECD produced guidance, reflected also in the US in the Dodd-Frank legislation, about what responsible sourcing should look like. And then, after all those years of debate and turmoil, the UN convened a process under the leadership of the now late Professor John Ruggie to try to define the key guiding principles on business and human rights. And that has helped hugely in clarifying responsibilities between governments, companies, and the crucial point, I think, that John included was that companies, when they're thinking about risk management, should not just be thinking about the risks that the outside world pose to their business, but also the risks that their business pose to the rest of the world. So this panel will look at the progress that's been made through those multi-stakeholder approaches, the partnerships, through the progress made by having individuals who are steeped in this whole area of activity, like my colleague Sherry Gittleman, the development of auditable standards such as the responsible gold mining principles, and public reporting against those. But the foundation, I think, for the last 15 years of progress has been the UN Guiding Principles. And I'd like to start our discussion off by turning to Jane, who was a key member of the team that worked with John Ruggie in producing that. Jane, how do you feel the last 15 years have gone? Where do you think we've made progress, and where do we need to look for future progress?
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Edward and Lisa and Gaetano. And it's, let me just start by saying, what an enormous pleasure it is to be here as part of this, I think, incredibly special community of individuals, of families, and of institutions who, over many years now, have played, I think, such an important role in promoting both sort of responsible jewellery and responsible mining value chains. And I think particularly to have an opportunity to talk about why respect for human rights and respect for people's fundamental welfare and dignity should be at the heart of everything we do when we talk about responsible jewellery, responsible mining, responsible business, and resilience. And as you say, Edward, even before the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, there was sort of, I think, at least sort of 20 years. You can even go back to the anti-slavery movement, but certainly sort of 20 years of focusing on what is the role not just of governments but of business. And it was almost exactly 15 years ago today. It was the 16th of June 2011. That the UN Human Rights Council unanimously, which is quite unusual, unanimously endorsed the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. And at the time, and still today, they were the first and are the first authoritative global standard focused on preventing and addressing and mitigating negative impacts on human rights as a result of business activities. And as we look 15 years later today, I think it's fair to say that despite all the very obvious challenges we're facing that both Lisa and Gaetano sort of emphasized, the UN Guiding Principles have not only endured and had an impact, but I would argue are more important and more relevant today than they've ever been, and more central to particularly this community, but all business communities. And I'd like to sort of highlight, I think, 3 reasons why I think they've endured and had impact and why they're more relevant today, and then share a few examples of where I think they're particularly relevant. First of all, I think one of the key aspects of both the design but also the implementation of the guiding principles has been that they took a system-wide approach. They're about business and human rights, but the protect, respect, remedy framework acknowledged that business doesn't happen in a vacuum, whether it's this business or any other type of business. And so their 3-pronged framework of the state duty to protect and the corporate responsibility to respect and the duty of both governments and companies to provide access to effective remedy for victims of human rights abuses, put business in the context that it operates in. It doesn't operate separate to government. And so there is that critical government responsibility, the responsibility of the UN, as Gaetano was mentioning earlier. And yet at the same time, business can't hide behind government. So the whole emphasis of the guiding principles is that linked to but also separate from government, business has a responsibility, however effective or ineffective government is in protecting human rights, companies have a responsibility to respect human rights. So it's been a very sort of system-wide approach, and in the consultation processes and design of the UN Guiding Principles, Professor Ruggie and our team were very, very conscious that it needed to be the whole system, not just focusing only on business, even if the core is the role of business. And linked to that, we've now sort of seen over the last 15 years where governments have had to play a critical role. So we've moved from sort of soft law, national action plans, national contact points, increasingly to regulatory requirements on business and human rights. But we've also sort of seen other actors in the ecosystem being being brought in and involved. So legal organizations, the legal profession. Professor Ruggie was very clear we needed to get the International Bar Association, the American Bar Association, key legal firms involved. Secondly, standard setters. And the key thing about the guiding principles, they didn't supplant the voluntary principles or the conflict-free gold standard. They enhanced and got embedded in those rather than trying to replace existing standards. And so the whole area of sort of standards and accounting firms were involved. Financial institutions, we got banks, insurance companies, investors, stock exchanges to embed the concept of the guiding principles. International and multilateral organizations such as the UN system, the World Bank, the OECD guidelines integrated them into their processes. Non-governmental organizations, sort of academic institutions integrated them, and also business organizations such as the Responsible Jewelry Council, the International Council of Mining and Metals, sort of integrated the guiding principles into their own processes and standards. So first of all, very importantly was that sort of system-wide approach. I think secondly, equally importantly, there was a lot of debate at the beginning, well, what human rights are relevant to business? And it would have been so easy to pick certain civil and political rights or social and economic and cultural rights. But Professor Ruggie felt very, very strongly that all human rights are relevant to business. And every company, every sort of industry sector and value chain needs to do the hard work of saying, all rights are relevant for all people in all places where we operate, but then how do we do that hard work and the due diligence of what are the rights that are most salient to us, instead of just sort of taking 3 or 4 rights off a shelf and saying, well, we'll just focus on those. So doing that risk assessment, the due diligence that even if all rights don't become salient to the company, that your starting point is that all rights for all people are relevant. And also, all along the value chain, we can't just say it's at the mine site or in the craft, the craftsmanship of making jewelry. It's along the entire value chain that companies need to think: are they causing or contributing or linking to human rights abuses? So it was a very holistic approach. And then thirdly, and Gaetano, you mentioned this in your comment, they were principles, and they are principles-based. They're not, and they were never designed to be rigid rules. They were about principles and how principles can be used to guide practice and influence systems change and adapt and evolve in changing circumstances. So I think those are some of the reasons they have endured, and they have been embedded, I think, in a lot of those different actors that I mentioned in the ecosystem. And I think one of the areas we're seeing them very relevant today, and it's so relevant to our theme of our Conference of Resilience, is the link to human rights and climate and environment. I think a big mistake all of us who've worked for over 30 years or more in the field of responsible business made, is we let the concept of sustainable development become about the green agenda and the environmental agenda only, and not people. And in fact, the original definition of sustainable development, the Brundtland Commission back in the 1980s, was development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. So people and people's rights were at the heart of sustainable development, but somehow it just became about the environment. And it was only in 2022 that the UN General Assembly recognized a fundamental and key human right being the right to a clean, healthy, sustainable environment. And I think now, as we look at the challenges of climate change and other environmental challenges, that the role that this industry can play in sort of saying human rights needs to be at the center of that, both in terms of managing the negative impacts of the environment on people, but also ensuring a just transition, given that the industry, particularly the mining sector, will change as a result of the sort of energy transition needed. So I think whether it's climate, whether it's AI, human rights today are, I think, more central both to this industry and others than they've ever been.
Thanks, Jane. Some really important points of learnings there. Can I move on to your neighbour, Maura Johnson, next? Maura has just stepped down after 7 years of leading the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights. Very much a pioneering organisation of multi-stakeholderdom, and as an early participant in that process, it was sometimes very tempestuous, with walkouts by civil society, walkouts by US oil companies, and yet, maybe because you've been a particular leader in consensus building, Maura, I think it's become a much more firmly embedded framework for guiding companies about how they look after their people and their assets without compromising the rights of the people around them. Tell us about that experience.
Thank you very much. Maybe I'll just bring this a little closer. Thank you so much for the generous introduction, and thank you, Lisa. I think a little closer is better. Thank you, Lisa, and all of you who've organized this wonderful event. It's really wonderful to be here. So I did want to say a little bit quickly about how the voluntary principles came into being. I think Edward mentioned that a little bit. But it came as a result of actually some really serious incidents that had taken place in places like Nigeria and Indonesia, in the mining sector, oil and gas, where protesters were being shot and killed, or there were other human rights violations, but obviously right to life is an important one. So the voluntary principles in the world of all human rights really just focuses on this narrow wedge, but an important one, which is the security providers. Because obviously if a security provider armed with a lethal weapon infringes on someone's human rights, the results can be very extreme. So, so this group got together, again, even before the UNGPs, and developed a risk-based approach. So every company, say mining company, and we do have many gold mining companies, precious gems. We have Anglo American, which owns De Beers. So many of your potentially who you source from are members of the voluntary principles. And every company does a risk assessment on every project about what the specific risks might be. Is the mine right next to communities? You know, do people pass? Do people tend to trespass on the area? Are there artisanal miners that try to come onto the concession? It's really a risk assessment, and then specific measures to address, mitigate, prevent those risks. And so that's the standard. And what has happened in the last 26 years that this initiative has been in place is that this standard has become almost ubiquitous across many different industry performance standards, OECD as well, soft law standards. But the World Gold Council has embedded the voluntary principles in their responsible gold standard. The RJC, who might be here, has embedded the VP. So it's embedded across about 15 or 16 global performance standards and soft law instruments. So it's out there, it's being implemented. But there's also an initiative, as Edward said, multi-stakeholder companies, civil society, and governments all working together to develop and implement best practices and standards for best practices. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about that process and sort of in the theme of where have we been, where are we going. So the first thing I wanted to mention is the multi-stakeholder dialogue can be a little bit fraught, but it's also incredibly powerful. So the voluntary principles themselves are principles, like the UN guiding principles, risk-based principles, just a few pages of principles. They haven't changed in 26 years, but there's been a lot of work to interpret and develop best practices and say, what do these mean on the ground operationally? And that's really where the rubber hits the road. And you see, we'll speak in a moment about some of the pictures. So for example, some of the members were saying, you know, we really need more guidance around women and vulnerable groups. Because the voluntary principles themselves are actually silent on women. But what happens if a security guard apprehends a trespasser who's female? Do the security guards have protocols? Are there female guards employed by the company? Are there procedures to follow to protect the human rights of that woman who's apprehended? Same really goes for all kinds of other groups, like children. When security guards interact, heavily armed, possibly guards, interact with the civilian population, are there protocols in place to protect the more vulnerable? So we developed a guidance on women and vulnerable groups. What's so powerful, again, is that there's this whole multi-stakeholder process to really discuss, develop, and articulate best practice. It's not just hiring some consultant to come and write a report. It's really about the dialogue. So, and I think that really lends a lot of credibility to these practice guidances. And we have others, VPs 101 sort of getting started. We have a conflict analysis tool, which is really important because companies, really anywhere, even in Canada and so-called peaceful and stable jurisdictions, they need to understand the dynamics that are beneath that calm In Canada, for example, there's a long history of dispossession of Indigenous people of their lands, and also spoliation, cutting down trees, poisoning rivers, and big projects that did not take into account their rights. And so there's a lot of sensitivities for any new project, and understanding those dynamics that are there, and they can be very complex, is a really important part of doing a good risk assessment. So we have a guidance on that. We have a more recent guidance on human rights defenders, which is another really important and interesting issue. And we are bringing out a guidance very, very soon, which is really a best practice guidance, and it looks at many different standards, including the UN Guiding Principles, the voluntary principles, and now mandatory human rights due diligence laws, particularly in Europe, and how they all fit together. And again, it's all demand driven. But this is a powerful tool that multi-stakeholder initiatives can have, is to actually develop best practice through this dialogue and discussion and debate. And something that I wanted to mention is, as I said, this standard is out there in the world. Hundreds of companies are implementing it through many of these different standards. And some years ago, the voluntary principles said, why don't we evaluate the VPs, because we don't know, does every standard need its own multi-stakeholder initiative? Are we doing the right things? So it was a very interesting process. I mean, in a nutshell, the members said, we're not a certification scheme, but we love this multi-stakeholder approach. We love the peer learning. We love learning from other pillars, from NGOs. We find the dialogue is really useful. So the other thing I just wanted to touch on is the multi-stakeholder element of the voluntary principles is also at the local level, and this is really critically important. And we have some pictures actually this is the Congo working group. So we have multi-stakeholder working groups in many different countries around the world. Again, same thing, governments, civil society, and companies getting together. This one is Ghana. This is a group of young people who were trained to be water guards, and it was one of the projects that the Voluntary Principles funded on ASM. And these groups on the ground, we have them, I'll just mention quickly, Peru, Colombia, DRC, and Mozambique are partner groups. And we also have groups in Brazil, Chile, Nigeria, Ghana. And this week, we're launching a group in Papua New Guinea, actually. And these groups get together and they talk about the problems, and they find solutions, and whatever those problems are. And again, it's very powerful to be able to talk about the problems on the ground and work collaboratively. So I think I'll conclude there and pass it.
Could I just ask, sure, because I'm not sure that everyone will understand this point, that in many situations, a large company may control what an insurgent group would regard as a strategic asset. So they need to be protected, not just by their private security, but by the government. And in those circumstances, of course, it's very difficult, isn't it, for the company to say to the government, don't you treat local people like this. So just give us a sense of how that issue is managed. Great,
thank you, Edward, for that. So in a lot of countries, private security are not permitted to have lethal weapons. And actually the government mandates that their own security services, be they police, be they military, are the ones that come and protect the mine site. So this is the case in many, many countries around the world. So while they have, of course, and as Edward said, this is because it's seen as a strategic resource belonging to the people, belonging to the country. But one of the challenges, of course, the hugest challenge, and we hear about this all the time, and it's one of the big areas of discussion at the voluntary principles, is when you don't have command and control over the police or the military who are there, how do you ensure that they are going to respect human rights? And this is a huge and complex issue that we do deal with. And I think the other thing is, if I could just maybe say as well, one of the most important things, and you think about this in the policing context in your own, town where you live, but the security guards need to, it shouldn't be us and them. They're there to protect the resources. They should be of the community, part of the community, and feel trusted by the community. Just the way a local policing situation. So community engagement and working with local stakeholders is incredibly important for there to be trust and for there also to be honest dialogue about the impact of security arrangements. Sometimes the security providers, be they public or private, are extremely intimidating, or they look like riot police, or they're armed heavily, and people are very intimidated, and that is not a recipe for good, warm relationships with the community, and therefore with the mine, right? It shouldn't feel like an armed camp, and sometimes it does. So these are the kinds of issues that get discussed in these working groups here, which is trying to really improve relationships and solve problems together. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that expansion and clarification, Maura. Sherry, can I turn to you, wearing two hats, because you were, within reasonable memory, working with Newmont, the biggest gold mining company, and now you're leading this initiative, the Global Coalition for Action on Artisanal and Small-Scale Gold Mining. Would you like to talk about the management of the interface between large-scale companies and local communities and small-scale miners?
Great, thank you, Edward. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Lisa. Closer, okay. How's this? Hope this is better. Thank you for keeping this topic on the agenda, which pleases me immensely. I've been coming to this event for a few years, and I love the diversity of the audience, the discussions we're having, and happy to see human rights continue to be here. So, Edward, you're correct. I've held social performance roles in large-scale mining companies for a majority of my career. I also did a stint in footwear and apparel, so I've had both that manufacturing, supply chain due diligence role, as well as that mine site role. And I wanted, before I launch on, I just wanted to say one thing about the voluntary principles, having been in member companies to the VPs and this issue about host government security and mine sites and how you navigate that. And one of the things I've always said is one of the biggest values that came out of the voluntary principles was that it gave companies a way to engage on human rights with host governments, which is not their territory. It's not our territory as companies to tell governments how to behave, how police should behave, or the military. That's just not what you do. But through this international multi-stakeholder initiative that brought people together, we had this excuse. We're like, we are a signatory to this event, so this is part of how we work, and we want to talk to you about these issues. And it just became less the company taking an issue with the government's action, and it's just a space, an environment for that dialogue. And sometimes it's not something you can quantify, but I will say, like, that allows, you see these working groups and people coming together. Sometimes for human rights, it makes people very uncomfortable. And so how do you start to create a space for it? And I think, just to follow up on some of Jane's comments too, companies are social actors in the world today. And so there are expectations about how we behave. And I think the time of saying, oh, I didn't know we were linked to this issue far off in our supply chain, we didn't see it, it's not anything we can impact, it had nothing to do with us, and we wash our hands of it, isn't accepted anymore, right? So companies really have to try and understand and find out what those issues are. So when you sit in a human rights role at a company, it's really daunting because, as Jane said, all the human rights are included. So you sit down with your management teams and you're starting to say, well, we have all these problems in the world, and how is our business connected to all these problems, and think about the supply chain and all the things that are happening. But I think they're really practical tools that the UN Guiding Principles give us that help companies start to navigate that. Some of this comes from this risk-based approach. So companies who implement the UN Guiding Principles conduct a saliency assessment. So you start to say, what are the most severe negative human rights that are linked to our business? What's the greatest likelihood of those events happening, and what's the scope of those events? So if something is, going to lead to a fatality and you can't remediate it, it is an absolute salient issue. If something is like it's a wage violation, okay, that's not great, but it's much easier to remediate somebody having not, giving them back pay than it is impacting health, impacting people's futures. So I think when you start to apply that lens, it gives companies a way to say, hey, this is what we're really going to prioritize. And so if you start to look at your supply chain, you start to think about the salient issues in your supply chain, it starts to create more of a roadmap. And it doesn't mean that you only focus on those human rights, but at least you say we've considered everything, and periodically we do an exercise where we relook at things because the world changes, businesses change, supply chains have definitely changed in the last few years. So you go through a process of reassessing that and seeing what's changed, and then you at least have a roadmap for saying this is what we're working on. You can also be, communicate it so your stakeholders know and your communities know and governments understand those issues you're working on. So I just want to share that with this room because I know the issue can be very heavy and it can feel completely overwhelming. When it comes to human rights, it feels like we're trying to boil the ocean. So we've got to use some of these tools to focus on salient issues. I'll talk a little bit about artisanal mining because it is such a relevant issue for the gold and gemstone space. And there are really a couple sides to it. It's a very complex issue, as people in this room know. But I think when we take a human rights lens to ASGM, there are two things we need to think about. First of all is the human rights impacts on miners themselves. So their right to a safe and healthy working environment, right? Land rights issues they may be facing, gender equity issues, fair compensation, health issues. Those are all things that impact miners. But we also know that because artisanal mining itself is not a human rights issue, but because it's largely unregulated, because there is increased criminality, because of poverty, because of outside factors, it starts to have negative impacts on the human rights of communities and others. So there are the miners themselves, but there's also the impact that ASM has on communities. And so when you think of that lens, you're thinking about mercury pollution and soil contamination. You're thinking about the health of the community, deforestation, child labor, human trafficking. Those are the issues that start to come up. But I do think from being in a mining company, one of the most important things we need to do is let's not forget that these are human beings and what's the human face of artisanal mining. Because it is largely illegal. In most cases, there are very few artisanal miners that have legal mining permits. So it's very easy to say, well, that's a criminal issue, it's illegal, we don't engage with it. So you kind of say, like, we don't see the people that are behind there. But who are the people? Where are they from? How long have they been mining in this area? Is it something new that moved in when the mine developed, or this has been going on for decades or centuries? So when you start to see ASM as a form of livelihood, and that is also a human right, the right to earn a livelihood, it starts to position it a little bit different in the company's strategy. And I think if you go back to like why the VPs were created, if it was just treated as a security issue, you've just have conflict, like you're managing something with conflict. With the price of gold today, we know that for any time that you clamp down on ASM or you try to get ASM miners to go into other livelihoods, chicken farming and tailoring and running a salon, that's great, but they will be backfilled by the next person that's looking for an opportunity. So we need to be more accepting of ASM, and I think that's a paradigm shift that's been happening in the space, so we're starting to see as ASM as an alternative livelihood. It is something that's going to exist. So rather than fighting it, how do we start to bring it more, how do we engage with it? How do we work to make it more responsible and more sustainable? And I think for mining companies, it is also usually an issue for the local community, especially if there are outsiders coming in. It's a problem to them. So how do we start to work together to say, are there ways that we can support artisanal mining by creating those incentives for it to become more legal, which will actually be a better security strategy in the end and help to address a number of the human rights issues.
Thanks, Sherry. Maura, can we talk a bit about the interface between large mines and small communities through the lens particularly of the rights of Indigenous people, and also around the whole very emotive issue of control of land.
Great. So, I'll put this a little closer again. So land, when you have community-company conflict, which there is very often, frankly, although I think the new projects are proceeding in a more mindful and more due diligent fashion, but there's often problems that go back to land. And I think mining companies didn't always ask governments when they got licenses in the old days. They didn't ask them who were living here before, what were the land uses in the past, what resources were being deployed by local communities here. But we know that people have to move typically because mining projects take so much land. And so this is the root of many of the challenges with local communities. So I mean, as concrete examples, of course, what happens if people say they don't want to move? They've been farming perhaps for generations, and this is actually an issue going on right now in my home province. And if Indigenous people say, well, we've been using this land and it's sacred to us for thousands of years or from time immemorial under the common law, then what? As well, there are often environmental consequences of mining. We see cases where groundwater is contaminated, groundwater that people need and rely on. So I think I just wanted to mention these are the kinds of problems that you see very frequently. There has been a lot of work over the years on addressing these issues, and there are, of course, standards, responsible mining standards, like the gold mining principles that look to addressing and understanding how some of these standards, how some of these problems can be addressed. When it comes to Indigenous peoples, there's actually a greater and greater, I would say, momentum around understanding the rights of Indigenous peoples and also respecting the rights of Indigenous peoples. And this has been happening in recent decades, particularly with the adoption of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is technically a soft law instrument. It's a UN declaration, but many countries around the world have been embedding that into their laws. And one of the key features of the UN Declaration is FPIC, which you probably have heard of, free, prior, and informed consent, where the project impacts on their traditional lands and traditional practices. So free means not coerced. It means a time frame that the Indigenous group can also participate in setting. The FPIC, in the UN Declaration respects collective rights. So Indigenous rights are collective rights, not individual rights, the way most of the treaties see them. Prior in FPIC means before the permitting, like earlier on, and it means with sufficient time to deliberate. Informed, right, means full disclosure of the details, sharing, for example, of environmental assessments. It means a transparent process. And consent means the right to say no. And this is a big leap, right, for a lot of governments to give and to acknowledge that Indigenous peoples have the right to say no, they don't want a particular mine or project. So it has not been an easy journey, but there's a huge amount of progress in working with Indigenous people. So for example, consent might mean that you enter into an agreement with them to share benefits or even share ownership of the project. And this has been successful in many places. So I just also wanted to make the point that when organizations, when companies, when governments partner with Indigenous communities, instead of trying to impose the project on them. The results are often much, much better, not just for those communities, but actually for the environment, to work on mitigating harms, for example, to work on creating conservation areas. So this is a growing area of interest, and I just wanted to raise awareness about it. Thank you.
Thanks, Maura. Jane, this world is not static, and as we deal with and create consensus around what good practice looks like in one area, new challenges arise. Looking at the horizon as you do, what do you think are the newer issues that companies now need to grapple with?
Absolutely. And before diving into that, I'd like to just sort of highlight one sort of theme that I think both Shari and Mara have picked up, in that when we're putting people at the heart of what we do, whether it's communities, whether it's our own employees or workers down the supply chain or customers, I think it's useful to think of absolutely fundamental as protecting and respecting fundamental rights. But there's also that point of sort of realizing rights and opportunities and empowering people. And so it's not sort of something that one's imposing. I think it's whether you're protecting and respecting rights or empowering and enabling people and providing opportunities through training, jobs, other opportunities. It's how do you make sure that those people have a voice and a place at the table, as it were. And so that the whole approach and concept, which is traditionally important, but I think even more important going forward, of stakeholder engagement. And sort of somehow stakeholders takes away the sort of the human element of it sometimes. It's engaging with people. Who are the people who are important in your business, in your value chain, along the entire value chain, and how are you really listening and learning and engaging with them and enabling them to have both a voice but also agency in how you're working with them. So I think that's, you could say that's not a new thing, but I think, particularly with the technology available to us now, which also has its downsides, the opportunity all along the jewelry value chain and the mining value chain to be far more creative and proactive in how companies, and whether they're small companies or large companies, engage with people in that value chain, I think is one, sort of key theme that is important going forward. I think a second key theme that is getting more and more attention is the importance of human rights defenders. And those, might be individuals working on their own or collectively to, in a peaceful way, working to try and represent communities that might not have a voice to protect and respect human rights. And so they could be journalists, they could be community activists or community leaders or faith leaders. I think there's a growing emphasis on both luxury brands but also the larger companies to be vocal in saying these people have an important role to play, and it's not always easy, and there's sometimes some real challenges there, but actually saying that the individuals who stand up for and often put themselves at risk in trying to protect and respect human rights should be themselves respected and supported and protected. So I think we're hearing more companies and brands talking about human rights defenders. I think a third, obviously, growing issue, as I touched on in my opening comments, is climate and resilience and adaptation. So it's not just climate and energy, but it is water, it's extreme weather events, it's growing challenges, I think, around land access, that it's going to become more and more important for companies and the luxury brands to think of that nexus between people, both human rights and equity, as well as climate, energy, water, and sort of nature more broadly. So that sort of people, climate, nature nexus, I think, is going to be a very, already is, but will be a more and more important theme going forward. And then finally, I think another important theme going forward, and I think we have a session later on AI, artificial intelligence, regardless of industry sector, obviously it's going to be both enabling but also disruptive. And so I think this industry and both jewelry and the mining companies down the value chain having to think about, okay, how can AI be used in a way that is enhancing customer engagement or bespoke design and opportunities, and at the same time recognize that it's going to be a challenge for jobs, it's going to be a challenge for intellectual property, there's all sorts of challenges environmentally down the value chain and human rights challenges associated with AI. And so taking a human rights lens to thinking about how AI gets integrated, I think will be important as well. So I think those are sort of some of the key themes, but at the end of the day, again, going back to the sort of enduring nature of some of these long-term principles, it's about every company, however large or small it is, wherever it is in the jewelry or mining value chain, really asking sort of three fundamental questions. What's my policy? What is my public commitment to respect human rights and to respect people's dignity and welfare? Secondly, what due diligence am I doing to identify, as Sherry said, the salient risks to people as well as to my own business and manage those? And part of that is how can I be resilient and how can I support resilience of the people who are part of my value chain? And then the third question is, how do I hold myself, if you're a leader, or my company to account, or how do we hold each other to account that we are being responsible? And so whatever the new issues are, that fundamental commitment to what's my public commitment, how am I doing due diligence, how am I really genuinely engaging with listening and learning with the various people and groups who are important to my business, and then thirdly, how am I holding ourselves to account as well as each other to account? And I think those are enduring principles, regardless of the new issues coming at us. And obviously, geopolitics, conflict, that's another conflict is as old as human existence. But obviously, new types of conflict will be another issue we'll need to address.
Now, I would quite like to ask my panelists a question about remedy, but I also want to make certain that you have an opportunity to ask. Are there some burning questions? Susan.
I don't know if there's a microphone. Thank you for the very interesting panel. I have to say I don't really know all that much about the voluntary principles or the UN principles. I've heard of them, don't know all the details. So you can inform me if this is an educated question. Especially with regard to responsible sourcing, how it is described and how it plays out seems to be a little different. It definitely seems to play out as companies trying to avoid risk, and how that often, and want to avoid creating these negative impacts, but how that often plays out is disengagement.
Yeah.
And disengagement or creating such high barriers to entry for suppliers that they're effectively disengagement. And it does undermine what you were saying about empowering and enabling is also part of responsible sourcing. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on, in this industry or any industry, how do you shift that balance more towards empowerment and enabling rather than only risk avoidance? Thanks.
Do you want to start?
Sure,
Cheryl?
I can start
Cheryl
because
has absolutely done this.
because we haven't talked about the role of legislation. And I think the UN Guiding Principles and the voluntary principles, it's voluntary, right? And so there's this sense of voluntary isn't cutting it. We still have problems in the world. And businesses really aren't getting at those problems in their supply chains. So then we see regulations increase. We see legislation largely driven in the EU, but also in many, many countries, forced labor laws and other regulations. My fear has always been then the lawyers get involved, and then everybody says, don't source from these countries, you disengage.
Yeah.
And now we have a clean supply chain, but we're not going to solve the world's problems that way. And so I think the intent is when you find a problem, you should be working on the third pillar of the UN Guiding Principles, which is the remedy piece. And what do we do to address those issues and stay engaged? So when I worked in the apparel sector, if we found a case of child labor in a factory, the answer was not, we'll stop sourcing from that supplier. No, we got engaged. We had the factory pay for school fees for that child until they graduated and then be able to offer them a job because they were working and they didn't have a form of income. Like, that was remedy of a child labor case. It was not wash your hands of supplier, disengage. It was like, be accountable for what happened, educate, understand, and how do we remedy it? I think as we do supply chain due diligence and we go further upstream, it gets really daunting for consumer brands because you just have less and less leverage. You know, you're buying a small part, a small amount of gold, or so how do you change that whole supply chain? And what I've seen be most effective is that's where you need to start looking at industry initiatives and bringing people together to say, hey, there is a problem in this part of the supply chain, and it's impacting all of us in this space. So how do we come together and start to engage that part of the world or those supply chains to take action? Because you can't do it alone. A lot of these problems are bigger than any one company, and then you feel like, what do we do? Let's just avoid it, right? But I think the way we want to see it work is you stay engaged and you bring other actors along and you use leverage and awareness and engagement to gradually start to change how things work.
I absolutely strongly endorse and reinforce what Shari said, both on sort of collective action. But I think also the late Professor John Ruggie had a wonderful phrase, principled pragmatism. And I think there's a leadership role to play here. And that, as you say, sometimes the easy thing is to disengage, as you say. And it takes, I think, real leadership and courage on the part of the individual leaders in a company and the company itself, and particularly if you haven't got collective action, to try and find at a very local level. Well, even if you can't do it at the industry level, are there some local non-profit partners you can partner with, or faith-based partners that you can partner with, to try and address some of those challenges without disengaging. But unfortunately, as you say, the more legal and legalistic it gets, the easier it is to disengage. But and that's where I think the collective coalitions that are represented in this room have a crucial role to play. To sort of say that at the end of the day, if we do disengage, the improving people's lives, we might undermine that goal because of disengagement. So, but yeah, and happy to chat more offline about it, because I think it's one of the core leadership challenges at the heart of what we're talking about.
To bring our group discussion to a conclusion, I would like to ask each of the panelists about the third pillar you referenced, which is remedy. And that was clearly put in place not to encourage multinational litigation, but user-friendly means of resolving problems quickly for people. How effective do you think that the average complaints grievance mechanism is? Is this an area where we need a bit more guidance and a bit more work? Jane, do you want to start off?
Absolutely. So, I think when we think of remedy, there's sort of, judicial, sort of state-led grievance mechanisms. They're non-judicial, which might be sort of third-party civil society, the company's own grievance mechanisms. There are, industry sector mechanisms. So there's a whole ecosystem of mechanisms. Yes, they can always work better, and again, new technologies might help with that. So we need to certainly make them work better. But I think one of the areas where we're missing, and sort of Shari picked up on it, is the training aspects and the support aspects of when there are grievances. How do you make sure that those grievances are addressed and that they're addressed in an accountable, transparent way? That's crucial. But what is one doing, and going back to the really important question, to train and support rights defenders, community organizations and others, or suppliers? If a supplier there's a grievance related to a supplier, instead of, again, disengaging from that supplier, what's the training, what's the capacity building associated with grievance mechanisms? So, they are a crucial pillar. We absolutely have to get the mechanisms themselves working better, that people feel safe and secure, reporting grievances to them and feel that they'll be listened to and there'll be accountability. But how do we build capacity as well, where there are grievances, to address them in a holistic way, not just disengage.
Maura, the whole issue of grievances is often raised in the context of relationships between communities and security people. Do you have any thoughts about this?
I mean, I agree with what Jane said. We are seeing more companies sort of settling disputes in good faith, which I think is a very positive change that's extremely important, whether through a grievance mechanism. But you know, if the company blasting caused problems in the village with people's houses, like just remedy it, just fix it. Don't engage in long, complex processes. So I think engaging in good faith. I would also love to see a role for more like ombuds people, or you know, the governments could play a role in appointing sort of third party, again, straightforward rather than really complex mechanisms to help resolve these disputes.
Thank you. And thank you to my panelists for a really stimulating, informative, and interesting discussion. Key words that I've taken away from the discussion are dignity, multi-stakeholderism, the importance of building consensus, the key role of stakeholder engagement and due diligence, and thinking about how, as the world changes, our terms of reference around access to resources and the competition for those, staying alive and constantly testing our assumptions is really important. Thank you, everyone, for taking part. Thank you very much, panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That's okay. No, it's okay. Yeah. No, I